Good morning, world. I'm Steve Rao, the host of Pod and Roku TV's World Edition, live from Morrisville, North Carolina, the All-America city in North Carolina, the eighth largest state in the United States of America. And we welcome you to this show where we talk about global affairs, innovation, an increasingly turbulent world politically, economically, and as we are on this edition, which is our Ukraine edition, where we're going to spend much of this show talking about the one-year anniversary of Ukraine, since I was in for only a few minutes on Friday. First of all, I just want to say that this last Friday evening, I was in Raleigh at the state capitol amidst many Ukrainian friends and leaders talking about the one-year anniversary in Ukraine, when Vladimir Putin invaded an independent sovereign nation, violating the international rules-based system that has been in place since World War II. Since his invasion, over 35 to 40,000 Ukrainians have died, hundreds of thousands of civilians severely injured, families divided and decimated, and hundreds of thousands of troops gone, Russian and Ukrainian. It's been a bitter and a sad year, and through it all, we continue to navigate and be inspired by the resilience of the Ukrainian nation. As I said in my remarks to the community in Raleigh, that the Ukrainians remind us that freedom is not only worth fighting for, but it's worth dying for. And as we fight the Russian Empire, we're not so much fighting the enemy. This fight and this war is about saving what we love, freedom and democracy. Somewhere today, as I give this remarks, a young child may not be able to walk out of his house without worrying about being bombed or shelled or shot. We take it for granted that we can drive in our cars and do whatever we want. This is much more than just about one war or one nation. It's about what's right. And we can do something about it. Today, we're going to have a special guest, one of my friends, to talk about this. But before I do, I want to give a shout out to Volodymyr Zelensky, Prime Minister Zelensky. The United States had George Washington, who as our general commanded our armies to win our Revolutionary War, become our own United States of America, and serve as our first president. India had Gandhi, the leader of Free India, that became today the largest democracy. The United Kingdom had Winston Churchill, who inspired a nation to get into World War II. And we also had Franklin Delano Roosevelt, whose calm, soothing voice led us through the Great Depression and to the largest victory in World War II with the Allies. But Ukraine has Volodymyr Zelensky, Prime Minister Zelensky. He is the George Washington of this era. I truly believe that 1,000 years from now, he's the president of Ukraine. I apologize for that. He will be revered 1,000 years from now as the one man who did what was right and would not succumb to fear and intimidation and brutality. I dedicate this show to his courage and his spirit. And we want to know, if he's watching this show, that we are here to support his nation with whatever we can do. With that being said, I am honored today to have with us Michael Brzezinski, who is a political analyst and also has ties to Ukraine. Michael, thank you for being with us today.
Hi, yeah, it's good to be here. I guess I used to work for the Polish Foreign Ministry for a time as well, and yes, I am a political consultant here in Raleigh. So I guess everybody has been talking about it for the past week. It's the one-year anniversary of the invasion of Putin's special military operation. You hear about it seemingly every day on the radio around now. And I think going into this, there's a lot of topics of conversation that are kind of on everybody's mind. The biggest one is war fatigue, I think, which is what a lot of the experts from Eastern Europe and a lot of the region analysts are kind of fixating on right now, because they recognize what many of us recognized a while back before, that while this war would not be short, it would not be a Russian victory. It would still drag out. Right. This is not a quick and easy war. This is the largest conflict that Europe has seen since World War II. It is the largest modern conflict between peer competitors with peer armies since World War II, or at least the Korean War. And what that means is that there's a lot of concern within Ukraine and within Eastern Europe and within the West that the kind of support that's necessary to fight that sort of conflict eventually dies down. that it eventually goes away, that gradually support dithers off because results aren't being seen. The reality of that is that the results that we're seeing is a stemming of Russian aggression at a cost that is borne almost entirely by Ukraine, right? The old adage, gold is cheaper than blood. Um, the amount of funds and money that goes from the West to Ukraine is minuscule compared to even the kind of costs that the collective West paid during the Cold War just to station troops and build weapons that weren't even being used, right, in Western Europe, to quote STEMI Soviet aggression. So I think you're going to hear a lot lately in the news about making sure that the right kind of aid is going forward. And I think you hear a lot of messaging from the current administration, from President Biden, about continuing nonstop aid going forward. But the reason you hear that is because that's kind of the most important thing on the menu right now, is making sure that we don't start getting fatigue, right?
Yeah, and that's the question I was going to ask. And I had so much to get into my monologue, so I feel, and I apologize, as President Zelensky. But one of the things I think it's fair to say, and we're going to bring our other team in as we ask you these questions, is that Fareed Zakaria wrote a good post, a blog in Washington Post, and it was all about kind of like where we're going. And it seems like whatever strides Russia made, obviously, they're losing in terms of being able to take over Kyiv, and the Ukrainians had success resisting, but even they, over the last few months, have lost territories that they've taken back. So at the end of the day, I think it is somewhat of a stalemate. I do believe that, one thing is that they could perhaps eventually, do you believe they could come up with some kind of agreement like Crimea and Donbass in exchange for NATO membership? But Zakaria mentioned that the money is continually important to provide Ukraine the ability to continue to fight. So it's really
Yeah.
some game at this point.
No, absolutely. I don't think so at all. And I don't think so because I think the last people to accept any sort of actual agreement that would be lasting in any way beyond, say, 6 months are Russia, or is the Russian government. Any kind of overtures that the Russian government makes towards, well, we want to establish peace talks, it's completely disingenuous, right? It is an attempt in order to try and not even actually engage in any peace talks that might lead to a resolution. Even if, quote, peace talks were to be established, the Russians would never sign any kind of agreement, none, that puts their own limits on Ukraine. They refuse to have any limits on Ukraine, hence why they're fighting a near total war with this country at this point. What would happen is this is disinformation by the Russian side in order to get people to stop focusing on arms shipments. One of the prerequisites of any sort of peace talk is at least a leveling out, right? A slowing down of conflict, right? So at some point, if you're establishing this narrative that, and you see this from Russian actors, well, the West doesn't want to negotiate, they don't want to talk. What they're really trying to say is, what they're really trying to get is, stop sending weapons, stop supporting Ukraine, stop the narrative that's going on in the West that's ramping up more and more towards more advanced weapon systems. We had the whole Leopard 2 and main battle tank conversation recently. Now it's looking like the conversation will eventually go towards modern Western fighter jets. Russia wouldn't sign a single agreement, not a single one. If they were willing to sign agreements, they wouldn't be throwing men into Bakhmut. The reality of the situation is that this is just another disinformation attack. This is another attempt to try and weaken the West's resolve. If you can convince the West that you're willing to maybe pursue peace talks, then you get actors within the West that are willing to start saying, well, whoa, the Russians, they might want to talk. Maybe we shouldn't be sending main battle tanks to Ukraine in the meantime until we've tugged at this string. And that's what Russia wants. It wants less support for Ukraine that will let it capitalize on battlefield victories.
Yeah, I mean, I think, so we're going to bring in Mark Lee and we're going to continue this discussion. I'm sure there's other questions, but here we are a year later. And I think, as we continue this war, we're going to see food shortages. We're going to see gas prices affected. And that's the other elephant in the room before I bring in our team. The economic sanctions simply have not weakened Russia's economy. What's compelling is that Russia's economy, because of the non-Western countries and those economies that actually support Russia, the sanctions have weakened them, but clearly not slowed down their war efforts. So I do believe. Don't you believe that it's going to take doing something with his oil supply and his oil revenue to really, really stop this guy from continuing to fight the war? Because sanctions normally don't work against dictatorships anyway. We tried this against Iran. We tried this against other dictatorships.
Sanctions, yeah, sanctions are should always be used whenever possible, but they're not going to succeed outright. The reality is that any sufficiently industrialized economy is far more resilient than people nowadays seem to give us credit. Us meaning everybody who lives in the industrialized world. If you just look at the example of the Soviet Union during World War II, not to make a direct analogy to Russia of today, but just as a sort of economic comparison, this is a country that lost. The vast majority of its wealthiest western provinces during the German invasion. Something like 20-30% of the country was occupied at its high point, which was overwhelmingly the very highly populated, productive, industrialized parts of the country. Yet it still managed to wage a total war against the German war machine, notwithstanding, lend-lease, etc. You still had massive amounts of Soviet war material being produced. So the reality is that the consequences of sanctions or the consequences of foreign action against your country that would stymie your ability to finance a war often just get offloaded onto the civilian population. The regime itself will never let those consequences utterly shock its capacity and utterly break its capacity to commit to the war effort. They will move whatever needs to be moved around. They will move whatever funds. They will access whatever sort of resources that they need to have in order to continue fighting the conflict, because the end of the conflict, especially in the case of the Putin regime, would mean an end of that regime. The consequences ultimately get felt on the civilian population, which is what we've seen in the conversation around sanctions, right? The the reality also is that, unfortunately, with these sanctions, I don't see much of a capacity for, say, a popular civilian uprising against the Russian regime. There are no elite actors within Russia right now that are primed to act against the Putin regime. And for any sort of successful, um, you know, regime change, you do need to have certain elite actors willing to engage and capitalize on that to push forward. So, say with the collapse of the Soviet regime, you had members within both the Communist Party and the armed forces willing to capitalize on popular resentment. Right now, you don't see any of that. So this conflict will drag out for a little while longer, just because there is no immediate end condition going forward just yet. But the reality also is that the resources on both sides are very limited. The difference being that Ukraine has access to Western support. Russia is desperately looking for support right now, most notably with what we've seen in the news with China. And the key is making sure that that support that they get is not able to replenish them significantly, which is why we see so much in the news over the past week on U.S. pressure on China to ensure that China is not supplying Russia with significant um, war material. Both Russia and Ukraine cannot fight this kind of war entirely on their own means. So I guess it really does come down to us in the West to make sure that Ukraine has that support that it needs to see this through.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's well. Thank you so much for being with us. We're gonna open it up now. Mark Lee is one of our analysts here, host of the show with me. Um, we want to open it up to Michael. Talk about the war, talk about
Yeah,
other.
definitely wasn't talking about the war, and our other guest actually raised a very interesting question that I'll bring up as well. But Michael, one of the things that I've been hearing folks being somewhat concerned about and everything is the money that's going out. Because sometimes when I talk to my friends that are in the social justice or other spaces here in the United States, they see how many billions are going to Ukraine, and then the standard answer is what could be done with that here in the States if that money was spent on some of the issues that are facing us. And that's not to say that I think that anything that's going on
You there?
is
Hey, Mark, I think you cut out for a minute, or maybe my connection cut out for a second. Yeah, I hear this argument all the time, and working as a political consultant in Raleigh, the primary chunk of my business and my work is about domestic issues. So, I mean, I get a little bit snarky when I've heard that question before. I like to ask people, well, if you have all these great ideas about what we should allocate those funds for here in the U.S. domestically, then let's start allocating those funds as we need them. Pull them out of aid if you are really so intent on that. In reality, those funds usually aren't being allocated. These are not funds that are being pulled from other social programs. These are not funds that are being taken out of anything other than our military budget, which is designed to ward off and to compete and to neutralize the threats that our country faces. And right now, those two big peer enemy threats are Russia and China. So you think of the fact that, okay, we spent $111 billion. I'm under the impression that if I went back in time to 1972 and I told a couple of the U.S. generals in NATO Western Europe command that we were managing to absolutely annihilate Russia's military capacity on the battlefield by spending $111 billion and not a single American life, enlisted American life lost, I think they would salivate and cry at that reality. So from a U.S. policy perspective, one, it's not money that's being taken from anything else. And I challenge any kind of rhetoric that I hear like that to please start allocating that sort of money to those great social programs that I personally believe do need that kind of support. And two, I wonder whether they would prefer for Russia to wait and attack, that we shouldn't do anything and let Russia attack a NATO country. And then we have to send in U.S. soldiers and lose U.S. lives on the battlefield, rather than sending a very paltry, really, truly, in the scheme of things, a very minor amount of gold and save, however many millions of gallons of U.S. blood. Right. So I always find it a disingenuous point, to be honest. I think it was usually often either it was cooked up or it's been pushed very heavily from St. Petersburg online troll farms.
We have Sasha Starr with us. I'm back, and then we also have another guest that's going to after you leave. We're going to bring her on, but she's here. But Sasha, Sasha's our Ukrainian expert. He's Ukrainian immigrant. Sasha, what insight would you like to share with us today?
Yeah, Michal, great to see you again. I'd like to point out one thing which probably is overlooked, that for Russia and specifically for Putin, this is existential war. Nothing else. It's really about its existence. It's about their ability to not only rule the country, but even physical life per se. Now, in the West, United States including, this is some kind of an exercise in some kind of a balance to not to let Ukraine lose the war on one hand. On the other hand, not to send so much powerful ammunition and weapons so Ukraine will actually win the war. Although even by winning the war for Ukraine, it's very muted concept, because what it is to end war in Moscow. It means to get out from all its territories, or all its territories but Crimea and Donbass. It's very muted at this point. But I'd like to point out this. So that explains why the West is so careful, why it sent so much weapons, but not enough for Ukraine to mount the attack that will get all its goals accomplished. So West is also running dangerous game. Look, Chinese, for example, which are considering now start helping Russia, they're considering that West is already committed and directly is involved in the war. It doesn't matter that they don't send their soldiers to fight, although there are a lot of Americans. Unfortunately, some of them are being killed, but they're volunteers. So, and not only Americans, but from UK, from Poland, from many other countries. But just by sheer the boycott, the sanctions, and sending so much weapons and ammunition, West is involved. West is committed. US is committed. So now, if Russia is still successful, it means not only that Ukraine lost, it means that the West lost. It means that all our society lost. Okay, it was the only people who will be happy about that are Republican bookkeepers. Okay, that's fine. But that's not all America. Thanks.
Oh, come on.
Thankfully,
That's
yes,
rhetoric.
I'm saying exactly what it is. Just keep your bookkeeping exercises. Oh, we send so much money here, so much money there. Oh my God! Oh my God! What are you talking about? Do you think that it's
Just
your
stay
money?
calm
Do you
and
think
talk
that
about
this?
the facts,
Do you
not the
think that
rhetoric.
this money would not be sent Ukraine? They will come to your pockets? Absolutely not. Okay, this money will be inappropriated.
So
It will be spent
let's shift
elsewhere.
over to Dan. Dan, let's get your insight, and then Lee. We got a few more minutes with Michael, just in terms of your perspectives, and we want to thank Michael for being with us today.
First of all, yeah, thank you, Michael. It's been very useful, the comments that you've made. Sasha is a real patriot for Ukraine. His passion comes out clearly. His biases about America are clear as well. And, but I honor Sasha's and his vigorous defense of Ukraine. I see a number of problems in Ukraine. I think I agree with the analysis that Sasha just provided. America is playing a dangerous game and not providing enough arms to let Ukraine defeat Russia. But Russia has been escalating the amount of men and weapons going in as well. So it's the reason for the pushback is because the Russians have committed troops and resources for that pushback. Ukraine's getting Western tanks and other things to be able to help them repel the Russians. But I think Sasha's right. The U.S. is sort of seeing this as a balance of power issue. The other day, Sasha was bragging about how Ukraine would be the largest army in Europe, and has visions of Ukraine taking over it's the geopolitical role in that area, adopting many of the other states and becoming sort of a Russian substitute, a Soviet substitute. I think the United States has to be concerned about that because right now Ukraine is a dictatorship as well. Isn't a true democracy because freedom of speech and other things have been eliminated in Ukraine because of the war. I mean, it's perfectly understandable.
I would push back a little bit. That would be like saying that the United States of the Union was a dictatorship during the Civil War just because Lincoln suspended habeas corpus. I think there are more factors that go into deciding whether something is a dictatorship.
Well, political
rather than just
political opponents are jailed.
Sure, and again,
media
sources the Union
are
in the North,
silenced.
We jailed dissidents.
Things, which are not the kind of things that we as a free people really advocate, right? I mean,
well, I really just
had any of the woke population. Hold on, I'm making a comment. If you had any of the woke population complaining about things there, about their woke agenda there, and all this money going to the war, you can bet that they would be jailed, and because they keep their big mouth shut. We got to worry about freedom. We got to worry about survival, right? So I mean, I don't blame it, but you guys are being a little disingenuous about saying things are free there. They're not.
I wouldn't call
people
it
fighting. People are fighting for their lives, and so you can't defend.
But again, would you characterize the Union during the Civil War as a dictatorship? Because everything you just described.
No, I wouldn't.
Well, then, I mean, are you familiar with the writ of habeas corpus?
Right?
Are you familiar
that was how many years ago, Michael?
Sure.
160 years ago.
No, I understand.
But that ever happened
principles,
again?
the constitutional principles. I mean, our
well,
Constitution is since then changed.
We saw to that was in 2020.
So, Dan, what is your answer then? Just continuing.
When our government collaborated with social media to silence the conservatives, right? I mean,
I'm not trying to speak to anything. I'm not trying to make a domestic political left or right kind of argument here. I was just saying that I would never categorize Ukraine's political system today as a dictatorship. I truly wouldn't. However,
And most
I do
political
recognize that
experts
certain.
don't.
I do
Most po-
recognize that, of course. I mean, certain wartime actions have been enforced, which is something that, I mean, even the United States did during World War II. These are things that, when you're at that scale of
No,
total war,
no,
absolutely.
there's
We did during World
Not
War II,
suspended
like what?
elections. They haven't suspended parliamentary procedures. They haven't suspended any aspects, actually, of the Ukrainian constitution. I wouldn't call it a dictatorship. That
and
being said,
Miguel.
I do think it's a dangerous game to play the fine line. I think the narrative that's been coming out here during this conversation.
Hey, let's go to
Hey,
V and then go
Miguel,
back to
but-
Oh,
Michael.
sure,
We have a few
because
more
you
minutes.
support Ukraine.
Miguel,
Well,
Thank
I
you,
support
Steve.
Ukraine
Hold on one second.
I support
second.
Ukraine because I
Miguel.
Let
understand.
Michael finish, please. He's the
I
guest.
realize there's some realities about balancing things out and how things
See,
are looking.
so this is where I would say that's dangerous, right? I support Ukraine not because I'm Ukrainian. In fact, I'm half Russian. I speak Russian. I'm half.
A lot of Russians are supporting Ukraine.
Sure. But the reason why you'll find the Russians supporting Ukraine isn't because they're self-hating Russians or because they just happen to be the woke liberals of Russia. I mean, this kind of
No.
analysis.
They're
The
people
reason
that-
why I support Ukraine is because Russia is not a stable situation. Russia
Well, Russia's
is
wrong.
not a stable. Russia is not a good thing for neither the people of Eastern Europe nor the people of Russia itself. And Russia is not a rational actor like other states. It is the last empire. It operates upon old imperial principles. It sees no limits to its ambitions, and therefore it cannot be negotiated with like a modern.
You know, you're right. You're absolutely
And so what I would say to that is that the United States kind of needs to come to its own decision and needs to kind of wake up a little bit when it comes to policymaking, because you cannot straddle a fine line of, well, we want you to win, we want Ukraine to not lose, but we want Russia also not to lose. I mean, there is going to be a loser, and deciding to actually set a firm policy agenda and decide to go in one firm direction, that we're picking a winner.
Does the U.S.
Which we do
want
have that right to.
Ukraine?
I mean, I wouldn't say we have the right, but we do certainly have the power to do, and it's something that a superpower always does. When major conflicts play out, we pick winners and losers. And so, if we're the sooner we get behind, I think the sooner we get behind. If you let me finish just this thought.
Dan, could you please be respectful? Excuse me.
He's not being respectful for me. He's talking over me.
Well, when we invite a guest to the show, Dan, you allow the guest to answer the question. If you're not comfortable with that, you can take some time off and come back. But this is a guest that's been invited to the show.
And I just have one last word, but I think the sooner that the United States decides that we actually do want Russia as the loser here, the sooner it will be better for our own foreign policy. The sooner that we will have a more cohesive foreign policy, we can actually decide to start realizing and start thinking about what do we want this region of the world to look like after it's all said and done. Now, at the end of the day, that doesn't mean that the United States is going to single-handedly, do all this. It's only possible because there's Ukrainians, because there's so many Belarusians, because there's so many Poles and Balts and people of the Caucasus that absolutely want to fight this battle and are just looking for our support. But the sooner that we decide that, okay, this is actually the policy agenda that we want and the direction that we want, then we can actually get to the important and critical business of deciding what do we want that future to look like. And right now, the United States is not in that discussion. And right now, you have a couple of actors as a part of that discussion: Ukraine, Poland. You have the Baltic states and the UK are part of that discussion, but the United States is not. And unfortunately, it's because we are a little bit too disconnected from this issue, and we would prefer for things to continue as the status quo, which the status quo, you can't keep the status quo forever. History moves forward, things change, and the longer you get stuck in trying to maintain a status quo, the more you dig yourself into a hole of not being preprepared for what comes next. So,
Miguel, just really quickly, it was a question that actually
Thank you,
Alexandria
Miguel, so
asked, and I wanted to actually bring Alexandria in as well. But Alexandria actually asked a question about social media and the impact of social media on the whole war and all in that space. And by the way, Alexandria does, even though she is a sports figure, and I definitely want to get to some of that as well, she does have ties to that part of the world, actually having lived in Russia and being born, if I remember correctly, in West Germany and all in that way. And was actually born under the Russian dictatorship of Brezhnev, if I'm remembering correctly, and all in that space. Please correct me if I'm wrong, Alexandra. I'm just trying to remember some of the points that you were bringing up, but you did ask the question about how social media is impacting both sides, both the Ukrainian and the Russian side. So, there was a time that the Russian Empire and a lot of dictatorships did not have the social media aspects, which is very much what they are using. So it seems like that is probably a driving force against Putin that some of the other dictators didn't have. But I just wanted your take on that, Michael.
Sure. Hi, Alexandra. Привет. Yeah, I think the Russian government has done a wonderful job at manipulating social media and getting and in general just as propaganda efforts against its own citizens. I can tell you, I mean, I have family members in Russia who are completely, brainwashed when it comes to certain things. The biggest thing is that there was this great book that I read when I was doing my master's on Russian and Eastern European politics at Chapel Hill, which was it was like Russia, a TV nation, and compared to the vast majority of other countries in the world, the overwhelming majority of Russians engage with pretty much all of their news and all of their information gathering through TV, far lower rates percentage wise compared to say other like European countries. In social media, right, through online. Now, you do have that. The biggest single platform in Russia and in the Russian-speaking space for social media is called VK, Vkontakte. It is like an aggregate of Facebook, MySpace, YouTube, and a million other different social media platforms. And the nice benefit for the Russian government in terms of that and how popular that one single platform is, and that it's Russian-based, is that it allows them a lot of control over the kind of content that's published and propagated through there. So you do see a lot of pro-Russian content put out through those channels. The other big factor is that the Russian-speaking world in Russia, those that have those that live within the Russian space, is that it's not quite as connected to the English-speaking world, to the English-speaking online world as the rest of say Europe. It is part of its own Russian-speaking world, the Ruski Mir. So you have all of this content going out, hitting these average everyday Russians in the Cyrillic alphabet or in the Russian language, and this isn't something that's easily penetrated by your typical Western social media. Now, there's one exception. Since the war started, you have Ukrainians who were part of that Ruski Mir, able to engage on this social media fight with the Russians. Unfortunately, I think that we have had some 20 years of brainwashing and propaganda that's gone on in Russia that most Americans are completely unaware of the true scale of it. That's been pushed upon the Russian people, prepping them for this war. Anybody who thinks that this war came out of nowhere just hasn't spent a single moment watching Russian TV, I think. And anybody who was watching Russian TV knew exactly what was coming. So I think the big factor is TV. I think Ukraine presents a very new kind of destabilizing force in the Russian social media sphere, because they are able to engage with Russians on their level and hit and really, to quote, modern day parlance, clap back, right? But at the end of the day, you do not get over 20 years of gradual, of very, very, very masterful inoculation of a population towards a war and towards like absolute genocidal racism in many cases against the Ukrainian people. You do not get through it with a couple of memes over 1 year of conflict.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Thank you so much. I mean, it's been incredible to have you on, and we get a little turbulent today, but we a lot of people are on edge, right? I mean, just the way this war is going out. But I agree that it shouldn't be. We need to do what we can to support Ukraine, and I think anybody that says, well, why are we giving the money and all that? I mean, at the end of the day, we're giving the money because it's the only way that Ukraine can win this war. And unfortunately, their country's been devastated as well, right? So even if they survive the war, the concern is, how are they going to rehabilitate? How are they going to recover, right? So it's amazing. So let's
I've probably taken enough of people's time, and I do have another obligation coming up. But it was great to have a chance to speak.
No, I appreciate
answer some
everything.
questions, and I look forward to watching the recording of this and seeing all the other great speakers that you guys.
We appreciate your time with us today. We are going to bring you back more frequently to talk about Ukraine, and we're also going to invite you to Sasha Starr's show as well. So, want to thank you for being with us today. And we pray for Ukraine, and I know your father is from there, and we pray
for my father's
North
family.
Carolina.
Yeah, I have some family there, but not
We
most of my
pray
family.
for the Ukrainian people, so let's thank you so much, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Okay, Mark, let's continue our discussion. We got
Well, I
about
was
20
going to continue the discussion. I wanted to bring in Alexandria, and actually, I want to hear her take on it because, like I mentioned earlier, she is from that region to some degree. Because definitely having been born there in West Germany, but she was also a female athlete pioneer. Actually, the was one of the first female to make and form the U.S. women's bobsled team there in 1994 and won the national competition. And definitely, that was some amazing efforts back there in 1994, and definitely is a advocate both of fitness and also of the environment. But I let Alexandria speak for herself about both what we've been talking about and also just on her groundbreaking work, because she's also been doing a lot of research on other great women athletes as well. So that's part of the reason I wanted to hear from Alexandria on this particular day as we're nearing Women's History Month and all of that. But Alexandria, if you'll share some of this amazing history of yours, I would love to hear that, including some of that family history as well.
Hi, thank you. And I have to say, I really enjoyed that banter. I'm so used to coming in and just diving into women's history and sport. So I'm thank you for including me in that, and I really enjoyed that. That was good stuff. So yeah, for me, I also teach kinesiology. I'm teaching women's history, and what really made me write the book is, I'm one of the professors responsible for teaching tomorrow's therapists and trainers and anything and all things sports, wellness, fitness, health, recovery, rehabilitation. And so when I get these 300-page textbooks, and there's really about 2 to 3 pages, and I'm not kidding, 2 to 3 pages of information on women. After a decade of that, I thought, this is insane. And so I started compiling notes, started researching, but of course the pandemic hit. And so I was only teaching online. So that's when the real research came in. And while I really started just to talk about women in sports and a lot of that, I wound up going back all the way to ancient Greece and then moving slowly through history, because where we are, the history of just kind of like what you all were talking about with Russia and Ukraine, you can't just jump into what's happening right now. You got to go back and look at what was happening. That's really what I did. And I throw questions at me, because I really did decide in this that I was going to cover all things female.
Well, one thing I was going to ask you just really quickly, one, you got to give, a lot of times women are doing amazing things when they are competing. Like you said, you did win that national competition, but you were doing it, as I understand, at the time that you were 4 months pregnant. And we do know that that has been a thing with different athletes that are still competing, even though they are giving childbirth as well later on in that space. So I just wondered, was that even a concern of yours as you were competing, because you were 4 months pregnant with your second child? I don't know how many children you have total and everything, but definitely that was at that time probably a radical thing to be doing in 94. There have been some other folks that have been doing it now and everything. And then I was also wondering your take on athletes that are also getting engaged in political activities, because we do know what happened with Brittany over there in Russia, but there have been a number of other athletes that have used their platform to talk about issues. And I was just wondering your take on that.
Oh, those are great. Okay, so yes, it was quite radical. So the backdrop really, and most people don't realize, is in 1940, Melville Dewey, as in the Dewey Decimal System, his granddaughter won an open competition in bobsledding, men and women, and she won. And when she won, it took the AAU, the Amateur Athletic Union, about 2 days to decide that they didn't like that. And so they stripped her of her medals and they banned women from the sport of bobsledding. And so it was 1993, and I was sitting on the couch holding my 6-month-old, and I watched bobsledding on ESPN, and I thought, this is the coolest thing I've ever seen. I waited for the women. They didn't come. And of course, then I started doing some research, and I found out that women were banned. And so that's kind of what started it. So I was not at all prepared to become the face of bobsledding, because I had a 6-month-old. But I did a lot of letter writing, trash talking to the International Olympic Committee, the United States Olympic Committee, just because I was also a former competitive fighter, which was also quite rare then. And so I thought, there's no way they're going to tell me I couldn't handle this. Had no idea what the sport actually entailed. And so when they called me in January 1994 and said, all right, we're going to do this. Are you coming, big mouth? I was like, yeah, I'll be there. So I literally had to slide wearing a kidney belt because I had just had my first child. And so I wasn't completely put together again yet. And then as I kept making the cuts, we found out I was pregnant with my second child. So when the nationals came, I was 4 months pregnant. By this time, I'd been in the news enough times that Case Western University found out about this bobsledder. And at the time I was squatting about 375 pounds free weight, sprinting just around 20 miles an hour. So they were really excited to have me be part of their program. So I always tell people I knew that my child was safe because I was literally hooked up to everything. I would train wearing EKG leads, oxygen mask, a fetal monitor, a heart monitor. I was attached to everything. And so I knew that I could literally see, I could hear her heartbeat when I was training. So I knew that she was safe, but I got a lot of blowback. Thank goodness there was no such thing as social media yet then, because I probably would have been creamed. But my child is super healthy and athletic and to right now. But at the time it was unheard of. And then at that point, it was fight on for me to get women into the Olympic Games. And so I hung in for the next 4 years just to get women into the Olympic Games with the help of a host of amazing other women. And that kind of ties into your second question, which is, so between what I went through, just because I was watching television and didn't see women representing a sport I thought was cool, that really opened my world up to activism and also research and science. And so I love that female athletes are being so active. Most people, you say athletes took a knee, and most people don't know that the first Black athletes to take a knee were in the 1960s, and they were Black cheerleaders. Most people don't know that. We think Kaepernick, right?
Yeah.
So there's a long history of things that women have done that predated who the male athletes we think did things. But we didn't write about females in sports really until the 1970s is when it started to pick up with the Battle of the Sexes.
Do you think it's gotten better for women
Lee,
in sports?
Lee's been very quiet today. Do you have any insight, Lee?
First of all, good morning. Thank you for coming. And all this, what you're saying is beautiful, and women should be included. I don't know what they were thinking, what have you. But do you want to speak to the abuse women have taken by male coaches? Jennifer spoke much on this topic.
Oh my word. Yeah. So do you have 2 hours? So yes. And so when I, at the end of every semester, when I teach my college students, we go through everything. We go through all the abuse. We go through the history, the how women are portrayed in the media, hypersexualized uniforms. We go through all of that. Title IX, why Title IX really is dispelling the myths. And at the end of every semester, I always ask my students, male and female, most of them are athletes. And I'll say, okay, let's talk about abuse. What can we do, in your opinion, after everything you've learned this whole semester, what can we do to curtail some of the abuse that we see? And I will tell you that my amazing, brilliant 20-something students will often say, they'll often say, it's just sad. That's just the way it is. I don't see how we can stop it. And that always blows me away because they're not saying it to be, snarky. They genuinely don't see a way out. They believe because of what we're fed all the time. And so this is a tough road for women to take. And it goes both ways because women, I teach that half of our problem with the way women are treated are women. Because women have also, we've bought into how we should dress, how we should look, how we should act. When female athletes understand, if you want to get good sponsors, you don't see a lot of top level, highly popular, coveted, ugly female athletes. You just don't. But we don't think we don't have a second thought about an unattractive male athlete. He can be a superstar. So women intuitively understand as they negotiate, navigate their way into sports, that they've got to look and act and walk and talk a certain way if they want to pick up sponsors. And so it's just a huge problem. I mean, it really is. And, one of the reasons that I put Simone Biles as one of my 3 people on the cover of my book is not because she's the GOAT. But when everybody jumped on her when she pulled out of the Olympic Games, and then we find out later on she was one of Larry Nassar's victims. This is the history of women in sports.
Do you think women in sports are getting more recognition now? Because I'm thinking about all the great athletes. The WNBA seems to be definitely very strong. I think about the soccer folks like Mia Hamm and some of the other ones. Brandy, I'm trying to think of her last name. That was part of. Thank you. And then some of the other amazing women athletes that are out there. I understand that there might even be some women athletes that are starting to break into what used to be male-dominated fields like football and hockey. But I'm just wondering, is it become so common that it's becoming almost no fields that are not beyond being broken in that sense? Because like I said, I can't think of a sport that women aren't in, maybe rugby. But even there, I think there might be some women rugby players as well. Right. You just said that you were involved in the fighting, and I'm going like, wait a minute, she doesn't even look like she has a fighter's frame and all in that space. But I do know that fighters come in various frames, and I'm not going to try to mess with you whatsoever because you'll probably knock me out in a heartbeat and all of that.
Probably, yeah.
So first of all, Mark, get ready for a slew of emails from all the women who are in the World Rugby Association. You're right. We've broken great ground. So this is where I love this conversation because, again, to my college students, I'll say, okay, let's put a stop to that just for a second, and now let's look at a few things, which is, right now in our top medical universities in the United States, we still use the 154-pound male model to represent women when we do research and clinical trials in medicine. We know that women, because of our hormones, we react differently. There's all kinds of, the numbers are quite alarming about how many women wake up during surgery because we react differently to certain anesthesias, for example, Ambien, sleeping aids, painkillers, but we're still using the 154-pound male model. And for all as you said, women are just everywhere in terms of sports. There's nothing that we can't do. We're showing that. But only 6% of all exercise science research, 6 is dedicated to female athletes. 6%. And so, the numbers are, this is where our real problem is. So how can we possibly be saying anything more about, for example, transgender female athletes in sports? I believe fully and totally that all people should be able to live the life that they believe that they should have. Absolutely. And I would never want to stop anyone from living their life. But I don't know that we can actually say, as the IOC did in 2014, when they said transgender female in sport, sure, okay. Very little research. And so my point is that I don't understand how we can let certain things happen right now until we up that 6% to at least 50% for our research. And and I'll tell you before anyone asks, the reason that we use the 154-pound male model, the reason we only have 6%, the reason that in the United States, we have the most fatalities during childbirth of any Western country in the world, right? The reason all this is happening is because we're being told, because of our hormones, in terms of clinical trials, we're too time consuming and we're too expensive to use. So it's easier to use the 154-pound male model.
Wow. That's amazing. Real quickly, Mark, before we end the show, just a couple of things we didn't talk about today, but just to let people know what's going on. And we want to thank you, Alexandra, for sharing all your insights. The CDC is investigating the train derailment, terrible situation in Ohio. So we're going to talk about that tomorrow. What does this mean? How does this affect the transportation department, the environmental department of the country? Terrible winds and storms continue in California. Winds and storms occurring. a new president of Nigeria, possibly. They've got a guy named Peter Obi, who's an unknown third-party candidate that might have a chance to win. And there's been protests in Mexico. So as we continue this conversation, just a couple of those things we're going to talk about tomorrow. But back,
definitely. And there's another one that we might get to tomorrow as well that I'll actually loop it into the question I'm going to ask Alexandria, because there is a white student that is actually suing one of our HBCUs, Howard University, which of course is also where Kamala came from, for $2 million over racial discrimination. So it's one of those reverse discrimination kind of suits, and it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. But Alexandria, I was wondering what your thoughts are in the sense of the management side of the athletic world. I do know that there have been a number of great athletes, women athletes and everything, but there are definitely on the basketball side folks like Dawn Staley and a number of others, but I don't know that there is enough leadership in the sense of women coaches and women owners and things in that space. But I just wondering your take on that, if there is enough women-led or sports organizations, and is that something that you would like to see more of? And then the other thing that I was curious about, and maybe you can loop them in, maybe you can't, is I also saw that you were an environmental activist. I'm going like, how does the sports world fit into the environmental world? Because that's one of the things that when I was doing my research, I found out about you. I'm going like, are they two separate things, or are they tied in together?
They're two separate things, but they're obviously tied together. When there's all kinds of studies about communities that are near heavy industrial activity, oftentimes, believe it or not, soccer fields are very close to these industrial parks. And so, I joke about it, but I don't, which is it's all great till you can't breathe. And I know of a place in Midlothian, Texas, where parents would joke, you could leave your wallet or your purse, but if you left an inhaler, it'd be gone in 2 seconds. And so, I obviously, I think the sports world, I love activism in the sports world, because we're a country, we love our athletes. And so if an athlete can speak to issues that are going on about civil rights or clean air or clean water or child abuse, this is a great thing. I know a lot of people don't like that. They just want athletes to stick to sports. But if we're going to call them role models, then let's use role modelism beyond sports to really help people see what's going on in their communities.
Yeah, no doubt about that. What about the notion of more women in coaching? Is there enough women in coaching?
So before and in my history, before women were accepted into sports, all of our trainers and our coaches and organizations were women led and women held. And then as soon as women came into a sport that became profitable, early in the 1960s and 70s, all coaches were replaced by men. And then the fight really began in the 70s and 80s to get more women into back into coaching. So it's an ongoing problem. Yes, we definitely have more female coaches, but we need so many more coaches. And to my point, if we only have 6% of research and we don't know anything about women's bodies, and I give you the example of Mary Kane with Nike. She was the fastest girl in America, and Nike swept her up. And an all-male staff didn't understand that female athletes actually need more protein. And they literally starved her and broke down her body and destroyed her career. And so we definitely need more female coaches who understand things that male coaches don't yet, but they're not educated. They don't yet understand about female hormones and cycles and how really big this is in an athlete's career.
How often do you feel that the portrayal of women athletes has been done well? I know that there was that movie, I think it was A League of Their Own, that was about the women baseball players and all in that kind of way. And there have been a couple of other ones, including the one about the UNC soccer team and a couple of other ones. But I was just wondering, how accurate do you feel the portrayals are of women athletes, even if we go back to like some of the early track athletes and all in that kind of way?
Oh, okay. That's a loaded question. The short answer is, so for my students, I break it down, and a lot of people don't like this. I don't care, because it's the reality. Is the white female athlete and the non-white female athlete experiences were quite different. This is I'm not passing judgment. I'm simply stating that in the early days, the only women who were allowed to participate in leisure sports, which was croquet, lawn tennis, golf, were upper class educated white women. Well, and so the first women in the Olympic Games were only upper class educated white women. And so this is a history. And so, of course, that historically speaking, that had a big impact on who had to fight the hardest to get into certain sports. You know, I told you my story of I had to fight bobsledding just because I was female, but the history is long and hard of other non-whites getting into certain sports. And in fact, the Latina athlete really didn't make her big emergence into sports until the 1990s. And as one of my college students said to me when I asked, why do you think that is? And he raised his hand and said, well, that's probably the most hypersexualized female in most cultures. And it's pretty hard to get respect when you're hypersexualized. Oh, you know, so there's so many components to the female athlete and what she's had to go through and where she is today and how much further we have to go. That's so different from the male athlete that I just think she's so interesting and she needs to be celebrated. But every semester, at the end of every semester, the 90% of my students say to me, I had no idea about this history. So that's what we really need to change. And then maybe things really will get better for female athletes.
So who are some of your favorite athletes? And then we're going to let Steve do his closeout as he always does. And I don't know if anybody else has any questions for you really quickly, but who is your favorite athlete out there in the world, whether it's in the United States, one or one from Eastern Europe or wherever they might be from?
Well, I have many who are long since gone, but I'll say one of my top favorite just won an award last night, Serena Williams. And I love her because she did not fit the hegemonic feminine ideal that this country has. She's too large, she's too loud, she's too black, she's too strong. And a lot of people don't like her for those reasons. And she's just, her spirit is so incredible. And what most people don't even know is she nearly died in childbirth. And coming back from having her child was incredibly hard. And so when she was wearing those, they called it a cat suit. People didn't realize that she was wearing that, just like I did in the early days of bobsledding, and I wore a kidney belt. She was doing that because she really was sort of healing from within, but she was still performing at a top level. So to me, she personifies the female athlete in all ways. I love her.
Well, it's been a wonderful show with you all today. I want to thank you for being with us. My final remarks are tomorrow we're going to maybe have a special guest to talk about Black STEM icons. It's the last day of Black History Month, but some Black Americans that have done some really innovative stuff in STEM with someone who's written a book. So, Mark, I'll be doing a virtual introduction there. When I close out on Ukraine, I'll just say that one of the inspiring stories that I walked away with was a story I wrote about a year ago on a Ukrainian named Misha Shevets, who is a PhD in artificial intelligence at UNC Chapel Hill. There's about 21,000 Ukrainian immigrants that live in the Research Triangle here in North Carolina. Many of them are in science and innovation. And what I find interesting is that most of them come from a city called Dnipro, which was the rocket science capital of the former Soviet Union. When Shevets, who's actually studying for his PhD, a year ago would call home to check in his mom and dad, he'd hear the bombs going off. And here he is 1 year later saying that the situation is getting worse. He's not sure if his mom is going to be able to make it because it's been hard on her health. But just really hit home for me on the people here in America and in other parts of the world who are affected so much by Ukraine. And Sasha, our heart goes out to you as well. Being from Ukraine, I know how painful it must be to see your own home hit, devastated like it is. But on that note, we're going to continue to monitor the situation in Ukraine now that we're a year into the war, more than a year now, a year and a few days, and we'll be talking about this again. But thank you all for being with us, and we'll be back tomorrow for another edition of Pod and Roku TV's World Edition. Thanks.